Hello, this is the Intrepid group that has been loyally following along in this second of our 8-week sessions. This is the last, and with some regrets, I have to say, I have no more plans for meetups like this, but we still have a great deal of work to do. So as I said to Shrikant a few moments ago, with some sadness, this is the end. And of course, he responded totally appropriately, no, this is just the beginning. And beginning in so many ways. Today's session 8 will be the second on the topic of solidarity. Last week, we had a marvelous opportunity with the guest of Victor Gaitan presenting the details of his life experience as expressed in a quite remarkable book, God's Diplomats. I hope many of you have had a chance to go out and buy a copy of that. Today, what we're going to do is we're going to fulfill a very limited but hopefully useful version of what James Joyce did in his book, Finnegan's Wake. As you might recall, Finnegan's Wake begins with an ellipsis, 3 dots, about the river run. And it concludes with 3 dots, another ellipsis. So it's a circular pattern, and we'll be retrieving a number of elements that we have discussed both in the Digital Catholic Social Teaching course these past 8 weeks, as well as some of the themes that we touched upon in our previous 8-week class on 3 spheres: East, West, and digital. First slide, please. We've organized each of the sessions on digital Catholic teaching to attempt to answer a series of questions. This has been Shrikant's very important and appropriate way of organizing these events. It has spilled over into some other activities that we have as well. So let me now go through these questions. What does digital, and by this I mean an environment based upon the fundamental architecture of digital technology, what does it do to Catholic social teaching? We have repeatedly emphasized that it is our view that we are already in a new paradigm. This phrase typically reads, new paradigm, new sciences. You'll also see, I think, a new paradigm, new structures, new paradigm, new rules. New paradigm, however, is the fundamental point that we've been trying to make throughout all of these classes. So, the life that we have led, the world that we've grown up in critical and fundamental ways, no longer exists. That is both an enormous set of opportunities and some very serious challenges. COVID, Ukraine, is only the beginning of what we are likely to be living through over the next few years. Hopefully, what we have been discussing here will help you to deal with a world that is, in fact, not chaotic, but is being radically reorganized. As we discussed earlier in this course, Catholic social teaching began in the 19th century. The shift from the print environment to the electric environment can be identified with many different dates. 1844 is a reasonable date. probably as reasonable as anybody, because that was the date of the first telegraph message from Baltimore to Washington, with the famous Samuel Morse, "What hath God wrought?" There's actually no question mark at the end of that statement. It's a statement. So that was electric conditions, and it was indeed in response to these new electric conditions, I would argue, the Catholic social teaching arose. It was not based on print, the environment that was at that point on the way out. It was based upon the scribal environment, which has been the underpinnings of the Catholic Church since it was founded. But it was up against a really quite incredible set of problems. And as we discussed early on in this course, the church had largely been pushed aside in the 19th century. Furthermore, the electric environment was in retrieving an oral sensibility, that is to say, a sensibility that we would associate with something even older than scribal. The dates that we typically assign to these things, which are obviously amenable to whatever changes you'd like to suggest, that oral to scribal transition, in our view, is associated with what people call the axial age. Axial age is usually given a relatively wide time period. Communications was much slower. Social development did not move at the pace at which we are now living, but roughly 500 BC. So you could think of this as the time in which the Old Testament was being written down. That shifted into a radically different series of environments, which we've collected all under the name scribal. And that is what we are now in the process of retrieving. So Catholic social teaching was produced under hostile conditions based upon an environment that had disappeared by that time, putting all of this in serious jeopardy. However, we are now in the process of reversing and retrieving, in fact, the environment on which Catholic social teaching was based. As a result, what digital does to Catholic social teaching is to push it into the foreground. This is no longer an afterthought. This is no longer a matter for specialists. We no longer live in the modern world, which is brought to us first by print and then emphasized by electric. And so we are now living under very different circumstances in which the digital technology that forms the ground of our experiences retrieves the medieval sensibility. Next slide, please. So the next few slides, I'm going to go through each of the three pillars of Catholic social teaching. Solidarity is the one that we discussed last week, and so I'll start there. Then I will talk a bit about subsidiarity and then human dignity. So what does digital mean for solidarity amongst humans? It is our strongest view that human beings are not going to be viewed as information processors as a result of digital. Now, you might think this is ironic because it was, after all, the introduction of digital technology that first gave us that linkage, cognitive psychology, modeling, human beings and information processors. But we were not living in a digital age when that happened. Digital technology took us in the wrong direction. And the information processor view now needs to be discarded. In fact, under digital conditions, it will become far more obvious to us that, like all living things, human beings have a soul. Soul is the English language term, as you know, from what in Latin is anima, in Greek, psyche, the basis of psychology. The human psyche is similar but different from all other psyches. Confusion about this issue, of course, is rampant in our times because we have abandoned the earlier understanding, which we are now in the process of retrieving. So, Book of Genesis, which is the underlying initial sacred text for the civilization that we call the West, makes the very bold claim that the human psyche is made in the image and likeness of God. Today being Easter, Shrikant having made quite an incredible study of how Christians celebrate, having gone to two separate Easter ceremonies today, one Protestant and one Catholic. There's a increasing interest on many of our parts to try to get to the bottom of all of this. And by that, I do not, as I've said throughout, I'm not here evangelizing for the Roman Catholic Church, or for that matter, for Christianity. I'm principally trying to describe to you what has already happened and what will only accelerate. These interests are not based upon anything that I have to say to you. These interests are subconsciously taking over our lives no matter what. And so, this raises, for the purpose of solidarity among human beings, the very critical issue of those who wish to replace humans, what we call the digital sphere. We'll get into an example with Elon Musk in a later slide today, which may be of some interest and stimulate some questions. But what we mean by solidarity under digital conditions is literally the humans sorting out what it means to be, what has been forgotten and now needs to be recalled, what the human soul actually means for us, and what it means for our human use of human beings. That last bullet here being the title of the 1950 and then radically revised 1954 book by my godfather, the mathematician Norbert Wiener. Next slide, please. Okay, what does digital mean for subsidiarity? Subsidiarity, remember, is if solidarity is the widest possible aperture. If solidarity is meant to describe the totality, then the question of how do we organize all the intermediate steps between the individual, human dignity, and solidarity. Subsidiarity addresses that question. And we have been under a great disadvantage under electric conditions. We have been severely confused about how we should, in fact, organize that in-between, that vast intermediate territory. The problem, of course, has been that we have indulged in a wide variety of fantasies about how human beings can be organized. I remember going back a while back on a mailing list that we run at the center. We had solicited the participation of the widow of a a very well-known social scientist. She's very well-known in her own right as well. And Marilyn Emery came into our group attempting to express her and her husband's life work that the only possible ways to organize human beings were in a rigid hierarchy or in a completely flat network sort of organization. That, of course, is false. That is a fantastic way of trying to understand human beings. There are many varieties of ways for us to organize ourselves. And the one which is going to come under great attention is already in the headlines. So what you would expect, what does digital mean for subsidiarity? It means that we are now going to have to completely understand, in particular, the structures associated with democracy. And if the principle of moving responsibility to the smallest possible unit is the subsidiarity approach, small is beautiful, as Schumacher put it, then the kind of thing we now call democracy cannot be sustained, not possible. So all of these headline debates or assertions or emotional expressions about democracy versus autocracy, all of that has to be discarded. We're going to have to examine this in some great detail. We're not going to be able to get by with memes. We're not going to be able to get by with simply our imagination. We're going to, in fact, have to remember, and we have a vast storehouse of experience as well as theoretical expressions to rely on. So government, as we have participated in it, is already finished, as I think many of you likely have already perceived. And in that process, the family will need to be rebuilt. It again takes priority. The trends that have been underway over the course of the past 50 years and even longer in the family are already in the process of being reversed. Furthermore, whenever you hear somebody talk about values and comparing values, you will probably note that the values that are being discussed are either quite vague or abstract or unfamiliar. And the reason for that is because the electric environment has driven us to some extremes, and we're going to return. We're coming home now. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, in addition to the cardinal virtues and other descriptions of virtues, these are all inevitably, this is not a matter of starting an Easter parade. This is not a matter of putting on a fancy bonnet in front of St. Patrick's Cathedral. Although that is kind of a fun party, and I've actually been to it a couple of times. We are now in the process of revaluing our values. That is a phrase that I think some of you may associate with Friedrich Nietzsche. He said things like this in late 19th century. So if you're following the bouncing ball, what was the transition that Nietzsche was talking about? That was the transition from print to electric, retrieving the oral. Nietzsche was somebody who was deeply engaged in attempting to retrieve the oral pagan, as particularly expressed in Thus Spake Zarathustra and other works of his. And of course, when Nietzsche said, God is dead, what he actually meant was that the Lutheran Bible was dead, because that was his association with that. He went to college expecting to become a Lutheran pastor. Instead, he retrieved the oral, as the electric did, and thought that values needed to be reset. Well, we're doing this again. This is a sort of turnover that inevitably occurs as we move from one environment to the next. However, the values that we are now retrieving are not the values of 19th century Basel, Switzerland, the ones against which Nietzsche was objecting. They're also not the values of the pre-Socratics that Nietzsche thought we should return to. The values that we are now retrieving are values from our own scribal, and in particular, medieval past. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last of the three questions regarding what does digital mean. And in this case, it's human dignity. Human dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity are the three categories of principles associated with Catholic social teaching. So it's pretty straightforward. What does digital mean for human dignity? Well, what it means is that humans get to be humans again. The irony of a world that is being taken over by digital, forcing human beings to retrieve their own free will, is a process we at the center will hope to write about in some great detail, but for the time being, I just get to assert it at a class like this, and hopefully we'll get some fascinating questions that come out of all this. But the retrieval of human free will and agency follows directly from the effort to try to program computers to have autonomy and agency. It is not possible for us to go through that process, the robot design, the artificial intelligence, artificial general intelligence process. We cannot possibly go through that process, which we're already a long ways into, without retrieving human free will and agency. This is the reason why the Stanford Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence Group, pronounced HAI, H-A-I, this past week in their spring annual festival, opened up with an extensive discussion about attempting to program ethics into algorithms. Now, I can report to you that the result of that is not looking good, but every redoubling of that effort forces us to come back to trying to understand what it is that humans can uniquely do. Secondly, the electric environment lumped us all together. So the notion of a collective unconscious, for instance, is a fine electric environment notion. No longer applies. We're not doing electric anymore. So that collectivity is being undermined every day. In its place, the scribal personality, the individual person, including the privacy of an individual person, is being strengthened every day. So this is the teeter-totter or seesaw, or however you might refer to it, is now moving, and this is something that is, if you know how to look for it, you will find it. You will likely find it every single day in the headlines in the New York Times, for instance. This process is well underway. Very importantly, in a world, in an electric world, in which collectivity was endlessly being emphasized, The obvious, one obvious example of this is the notion that we live in a class society. That, of course, was then replaced in many respects by the notion that we live in a mass society. So Marshall McLuhan's book, The Medium is the Massage, can be read, the medium is the mass age. That was the electric environment. And under those circumstances, as you would expect, the notion of human freedom had to withdraw into a negative position, had to withdraw into a freedom from coercion, freedom from censorship, freedom from anybody attempting to, as the postmoderns would put it, even impose a grand narrative. Freedom from. That is not the way this will be expressed going forward. Instead, it is flipped already into a positive understanding of freedom, where freedom becomes freedom to, freedom to become human, for instance. And this shift in the understanding of freedom is, as Trey has noted here, there are theological ramifications of this. This is not a shift that has never happened before. This is something that we ought to become more and more familiar with. And just to finish out what this means for human dignity, Marshall McLuhan, who's very important for the work that we do at the center, was granted his Cambridge PhD entitled The Classical Trivium in 1943. That is a remarkable work that I can only highly recommend for the more advanced students who are trying to understand how McLuhan came to these recognitions. But in particular, the trivium consists of grammar, rhetoric, and dialectics, the three principal components that made it be called the trivium. The trivium is something that is already been working its way through our educational systems. In particular, the homeschooling movement in the US, but more broadly around the world, has embraced various understandings of the trivium. That is now being incorporated into elementary, junior, and high school curriculum. I'm in contact with some fascinating people who have made significant advances in returning to a trivium-based curriculum. We at the center are attempting to do the same thing at the graduate school level. So human dignity requires us to move away from this dialectical argumentation and instead emphasize the structures of the world in which we live and the grammar of the society in which we are operating. And this shift from dialectics, which has been dominant, to a grammar-based approach is an enormously important one for the continuing growth of human dignity. Next slide, please. So I'm going to now remind folks here who have been so patient and have been with us through many of these sessions of the structure, grammar of the world in which we now live. It is a new paradigm and therefore new geopolitical structures. As we described in some detail in the previous course that we did with 52 Living Ideas, the East is ultimately based on a linguistic structure of logograms, the West, in turn, based on an alphabetic structure, And the new digital sphere is based upon code with the way, the virtues, and the spark as the goals of these respectively, as we have described this. Now, are we the only people who have figured out that globalism isn't working anymore? Of course not. In fact, as I am learning in some of my conversations with people, the level of recognition that this has already happened, particularly as highlighted by the events in Ukraine, have become almost to the level of people's heads exploding. The degree of freakout, if you will, is absolutely tangible. The notion that Humpty Dumpty is being put back together again, that NATO is stronger than ever, and that everything now has clicked back into place, and that Sweden and Finland are going to join NATO. All of that is whistling past the proverbial graveyard. We are already well into a multi-centric, polyhedral, multi-sphere environment, one in which, as we discussed last week, God's diplomats from the Vatican have a far more significant role to play, perhaps, than they did in the globalist era. Now, for those who have been poking around the edges of what's going on, in particular in Russia, you may have come across the name Alexander Dugin. I guess I should begin by saying that I've studied Alexander Dugin, and it is mostly, what he has to say is mostly nonsense. Furthermore, his success in trying to put together a strategic description of where Russia fits in the world has likely been already discarded by those who 20 years ago, Dugin was a big deal once upon a time, and he probably was a big deal amongst the Russian military general staff in particular. But his description of the sea and land powers, which is an interesting way to draw political structures, is lacking any understanding of technology. It's lacking any understanding of, in particular, the role that China will play. So you can go back and read his earlier workings. He doesn't get either technology or China. Therefore, he cannot be a particularly useful guide. And yet what has happened here, not surprisingly, is that he has already adopted this notion of multicentric and polyhedral. So all I'm illustrating here by bringing up Alexander Dugin is that even on that fringe, it's become obvious that we're no longer doing the globalism. So it's all the way from the center to the edge. We're doing something different now, what we call three spheres. And maybe we will do another course in the future on this and related topics. I find formal causality is probably one of the most difficult issues. I just, in fact, have read an essay published yesterday by a fellow who I know, attempting to explain Marshall McLuhan and getting it wrong on just this point. So this fellow insists that we have to, instead, that McLuhan was mistaken, formal causality, it wasn't forms that were causing things to happen in our lives, forms being technologies here. Instead, it was instrumental, efficient causality. And so this debate, I very much welcome. This is essential as the logogram alphabet code components are of our East, West, and digital. So as we get into wider conversations about what has replaced the one world, new world order, various terms for it, formal causality will become a very important part. This is something that, by the way, my partner, Phil Midland, when we began discussing this many years ago, because he understands China as well as he does, he could immediately grasp, without the philosophical background, without the historic background, oh, I understand. The Chinese never lost their understanding of formal causality. That is a critical difference between East and West. Next slide, please. Okay. By now, those of us who are required to pay attention to daily events, not that I'm complaining, have been reintroduced in a very dramatic way to Elon Musk. What is he up to? Well, let's try to put this in the context of the three spheres. Elon Musk is the digital sphere. He's not happy with human beings as they currently are. He wants to fix our problems with his Neuralink investigation, implanting electrodes into our brains. And he thinks the most important product that he's likely to produce is not the automobiles, but rather the robots, Tesla robots. He is digital sphere. The opposition, his opponents here, are mass media, radio, television. And as many of you probably have noted, perhaps with some sympathies for Musk, he really has put his foot in it this time. This is to say, the announced bid this past week to purchase Twitter. $43 billion, as he has been quoted. The economics are not what bother him. He really wants to put free speech back on the table. Well, as it turns out, free speech isn't a specifically digital interest. It has become a negative in the electric environment, so it is even older. So here we have these various environments right in front of us, headline material. Above the fold, we have the digital sphere fighting the electric sphere using a print sensibility issue in order to try to open that up. And I can tell you from other conversations that I've been having, don't know if Bill Frezza is with us here today, but he is deeply involved with this topic. The interest and sensitivity to this topic of free speech is enormous and is likely to spill over in any number of very powerful ways, of which Elon's acquisition bid is only one of the first. And this underscores the difference between the way the East and the West are dealing with this digital sphere. The East, of course, told people they could not issue new stock, that executives would disappear for a couple of months and get re-educated, because the East has incorporated digital technology into a very sophisticated metaverse, way beyond what the previous Facebook, now Meta, has been thinking. Whereas in the West, we have no coherent approach to this except to try to hold down people like Elon Musk. That will not work. And so now let me just note for you, I don't know how widely this audience has been reading on this topic of Elon Musk and Tesla, and Twitter rather. But some very interesting questions have arisen, making me want to go back to my days as a Wall Street technology strategist. Who actually owns Twitter? Who keeps Twitter in business? Now, you may not know this, but not only is Twitter a small business, but they have not made a profit. And they have no public plan on how to make a profit. And so, in fact, in many ways, they're a non-business. It's almost as if there's another interest involved. There's some other reason for Twitter even existing. And so this has led to speculation. I'm not here trying to fuel that speculation or support it, only reporting to you that as people have begun to look at the financials for Twitter, they have begun to come back and say, what's going on here? What is this as a business? I remember the days when I was the only analyst in New York City following Sony Corporation. Sony is a Tokyo-based corporation, but they had temporarily actually moved their headquarters to New York. So the CEO of Sony resided in the Sony building on Madison Avenue. So I picked up coverage of them. And in the process, I tried to figure out who actually owns this company. Where is the deep ownership? And much to my surprise, the information was actually there. So I suspect we're going to get a lot more information on Twitter. And it turned out that a significant portion of Sony Corporation was owned by the Chase Manhattan Bank Trust Department. Now, there's a history involved there, a Rockefeller history with Sony that I won't bother to get into here, but I can tell you that many questions, you start flipping over rocks and things start wiggling at you. So what is Elon Musk up to here? Elon Musk is actually challenging the elites, which have been sinking dramatically, and putting himself forward, as you might expect, as the alternative. This rotation of elites is exactly what happens in a paradigm shift, like the one we're going through now. Next slide, please. I certainly didn't do that title right. I'll get that fixed. The title is supposed to be, Can Humanity Survive in the Digital Era? And this is not a foregone answer. I do not want to come to you presenting this as if I am a rosy optimist. I am not. I'm also not here to present this as if I am pessimistic about the outcome, but rather, as Marshall McLuhan would have described himself, as an apocalypsist. That is to say, we're dealing in the territory of revelation here. We're not dealing in the, this is the result I want. We're not dealing with the, this is my best guess. We're dealing with, as best we can, recognition of the actual situation as we're experiencing it today, in its context and in the directions it is likely to go. Existential threats against humanity, can humanity survive, have of course fallen into a wide variety of categories. The knee-jerk category nowadays, which means that it no longer carries really any of the force that it once had and has played out, is the climate crisis issue. Maybe there'll be some questions on that, but I'm here to assert to you with a high degree of certainty that that is not the principal existential threat now being faced by humanity. Many other topics have been suggested over the years: overpopulation, inability to feed people, and so forth. what is going to happen over the course of the next few years and is already there knocking on the front door is the existential threat associated with robots. You will be able to gauge the degree to which people have made a transition from the previous environment to the new environment as they begin to relocate the existential threats associated with humanity. So we're in that transition point now. The whole field of post-humanism and transhumanism is remarkably widespread. You may have to go looking for it, but this goes beyond just simply running somebody for presidential candidate. The conviction in many people's minds that humanity now needs to be replaced is not simply a philosophical topic. I will guarantee you that what is happening now in Ukraine and what will follow will only accelerate efforts to replace humans as seen as victims on the nightly news, seen in video clips as propaganda being used in some sense by both sides. The purpose of human beings in warfare has already been determined. This is the reason why Henry Kissinger, the geostrategist, wrote his most recent book, which I can also recommend to you, The Age of AI. The robots change everything, he has said publicly, and he is correct. That is a memo that many people have not yet gotten, but they will. These represent challenges for humanity. And indeed, digital is not a unifying force, it is a dividing force. Moving to the kind of solidarity that I think many of us would want to have may become more difficult under digital conditions. It will need to be thought through very carefully. The fact that religion has been removed by and large from the approach taken by the elites in the Western civilization was identified very early on by Oswald Spengler as the fundamental problem and the decline of civilization being associated with that. 50 years later, Fred Pollock, the Dutch futurist, in his chapter, The Futureless Future, came to the same conclusion. Without religion, civilization cannot become coherent. So, does that mean that if religion does not re-enter into our lives in a fundamental fashion, that we, humanity, will not survive? Again, a very serious existential threat. So I will conclude what has been 8 weeks here with the last bullet point and the most important one of all. I thank all of you really for your help. I thank all the folks at the center who have been working with us, Shrikant and Peter and others, to bring this set of sessions to your attention. And now I'm going to hand it back to Shrikant, who is as human as they come.
Thank you, Mark. Let's get started with Q&A. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark in order to ask questions. Try to keep your questions as concise as possible so we can get to as many questions and as many answers to questions as we possibly can. So go ahead and type exclamation mark in chat or raise your hand in Zoom in order to ask questions. We'll collect all the questions, organize all of them, and then proceed to answer them. We're going to start with DLJ. Give me just a second. Let me go ahead and unmute everybody. Go ahead, DLJ.
Yeah, well done. That works. Morning, evening, whichever time zone you're in. So yes, that last question is the first question of my book that I'm working on, which is related to AI and ethics and autism. It starts with, what does it mean to be human? Because if you're trying to program AI, the first question is, what is the definition of human? So I'm going to throw that straight back at you. Can we have a working definition of human so we can start programming it? Off you
Excellent.
go.
Thank you. Thank you, DLJ. Anybody else? This is the time to ask. We are going to collect all the questions and then we're going to go for all of them. While people are lining up for questions, let's go ahead. Wait a minute. Mike has a question. Mike, go ahead and ask your question. Question, please.
You de-emphasized economics rather than information. It's taken back to the concept of it's not the people who vote that count, it's who counts the votes that counts. Is it going to be necessary to sway public opinion, or do you just sway the digital dollar or a great reset or something of that order? Thank you.
Wonderful. Excellent question. Is it public opinion or economic? Okay, Trey. Trey, would you like to ask? Go ahead, you can ask the question. Okay, let me, Trey, would you like to unmute and ask the question, or shall I go ahead and? Okay, I'm going to go ahead. No mic. Okay. He says, would love to hear Mark's elaboration of Dugin. He seems to have a morbid fascination for Nick Land's work. Okay, so more on Dugin. All right, so let's start with the question about human first. Mark, what does it mean to be human?
Human beings cannot be programmed. We have learned this. We have a century of attempts in social science, from sociology to anthropology to psychology to social psychology to economics to history and beyond, and it has utterly failed. So as a result of this, inability to program human beings, there has been, I think, a reevaluation of what AI is in fact trying to do. The efforts that are underway at Stanford and elsewhere to try to make sure that the robots behave themselves. These are algorithms, they're typically not embodied. So yes, when I use the term robot, I'm using it in a more expansive sense than a metallic object with arms and legs. My best information is that the AI researchers are increasingly coming to ask the question, why are we trying to duplicate humans anyway? Why don't we make something better? This pendulum is likely to swing in multiple directions. It will depend on who is doing the funding. It'll depend upon what they want the public to think about what they're doing. But biology is not computational. Simply is not. I personally experienced this early. I think I probably was about 19 or 20 years old, undergraduate, University of Wisconsin-Madison, studying many of these same materials, trying to understand the relationship between information, entropy, and life. And I came to a very early conclusion. I'm an old man now. I've had many opportunities to re-examine this. I've had many opportunities to talk to people who would convince me otherwise. They cannot do it. Attempts to shift to a computational model, information processing model, for biology, despite the fact that massive sums of money, particularly in complexity science, hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars have been spent. Some of the smartest people in our times have concentrated on this, and they have all failed. Cannot be done. It turns out that human beings, like other living organisms, are not systems. That whole systems approach, and indeed the information approach, is going to collapse. It cannot possibly sail off for the next 20, 30 years, being funded at the level at which it's being leveled. We're going to have to re-examine all of this. So I think it's fascinating, DOJ, that you're writing a book about this. I hope that you have some collaborators that you can work with that will be of some assistance, as opposed to pointing you in the wrong direction. It may very well be, however, that there isn't an audience for a book that tells the truth about these matters yet. So I don't know how many copies you want to sell, but you're writing a book right at the cusp of the recognition that there's something really fundamentally wrong in this whole artificial intelligence, in particular artificial general intelligence effort. And a proper understanding of, as you suggested, autism, that is to say, removed from the current consensus as expressed by cognitive psychology, which models human beings on computers. And there have, needless to say, autism is not a brand new phenomenon. It may have accelerated in many respects, and that is certainly important to understand. But how have human societies dealt with what we would today call autism? And how do they understand that phenomenon in relationship to human dignity? I would hope that there's a chapter in your book on the topic of Catholic social teaching as it deals with these issues.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to take a question from Connor, which relates to this. He asked, what did Aquinas get wrong? I'm presuming it is about human psychology. What from everything that we have learned via science and philosophy and the thought of other philosophers has improved Aquinas' thought? I'm curious if you're familiar with people like John Milbank's work on radical orthodoxy, or John Scott's Erudition. Go ahead, Mark.
Right, Connor, thank you. Well, that's a wide-ranging question with a wide-ranging set of reference. As it turns out, and as I'm sure you know, and I'll just skip over this a bit for this audience. John Milbank has described himself as a postmodern Augustinian. I happen to have been at a conference presenting on the topic of three spheres, organized by some of Milbank's colleagues a couple of weeks ago, the Telos group in New York. So I'm quite familiar with these folks. If there is to be a discussion about what Aquinas got wrong, the question probably will come into an attempt to contrast the psychology of Augustine with Aquinas. Now, Augustine, as we all know, or might know, did not read Greek and did not have access to Aristotle. And so what you wind up with is typically described as Neoplatonic. Well, as it turns out, a great deal of what wound up in Aquinas, particularly through the pseudo-Dionysius, is also Neoplatonic. So while I have read hundreds of papers and a handful of books on these topics, my primary point here would be to say that most people, when they're addressing the questions of human psychology as expressed in Augustine and Aquinas, if they deal with this topic at all, they tend to be very superficial and or very wrong. So we have an opportunity. Every person here has all the words of Saint Augustine and Saint Thomas Aquinas in their hands right now. The computer you're typing on, the cell phone that you're connected on, it is all there, complete with many interpretations of what this means. And so this may also be pointing to another series for what we're trying to do here. Remembering what they and what Scotus and what many others had to say, because there was no enforced uniformity on these topics. These are not doctrinal topics for the church. These are subjects that people can and have had many different views about. I think this would be a really interesting area to explore. And here, let me highlight a man who you can find on Shukant's list. His name is Brian Campbell. Brian Campbell has his own teaching organization called the Lyceum. And he has been digging into, in particular, Aquinas's technology, or rather psychology. Aquinas, yes, it is technology. Psychology in terms of faculty psychology. So my request to Connor and anyone else who is interested in these topics is, let us all begin to understand these subjects in far more depth. Let us actually read the original works. Let us solicit, encourage, participate in discussions ourselves, because cognitive psychology, modeling human beings on computers, with the notion that the form can somehow be captured in information, which it cannot. That is an obscuring of what a form actually means, with a prefix and a suffix, bearing the form in the middle. We have a lot of work to do to remember what it means to be human and to build a whole new range of social sciences based upon this. So my answer to the question is back to the future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. Next, let's take the question from Mike. He asked, do you deliberately de-emphasize economic issues? What is going to be the ruling factor here? Public opinion, economic constraints, and how do you think about this?
Right. The ruling factor here, Mike, is going to be technological environments. Neither public opinion nor economics. It's something which is not considered as a cause in most conversations at all. Rather than being information processors, human beings have the capability to recognize forms. And forms are so much more important than information, largely because they are real, because they are actually in the constitution of the world that surrounds us. Obviously, coming into the 20th century, there was a conflict of straightforward basis. And to be sure, those who said that the economic interests, particularly the class economic interests, typically regarded as the Marxist underlying theme, that was going to be the determining factor for history. So they could take Hegel, they could stand him on his head, turn him inside out, turn him into something that he wasn't, which is frequent for any of these characters. But then assert that there was going to be a series of class uprising that economics would ultimately decide today. That is absolutely not what happened in the 20th century. Needless to say, that is not the way that it went. And very importantly, in the midst of the 20th century, the Rockefellers spent a ton of money investigating the impact of radio and came away with a very powerful formulation that economic class was not actually what was working here, but rather mass media was what was working here. So this was 1940s. So we're a long ways away from thinking that economics is driving the situation. But mass media and mass opinion then became the focus of that effort. What we are saying is that we are now past that also. So to the extent the print environment emphasized economic development, emphasized progress, gave us characters like Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who doesn't get nearly as much attention as he should. And to the extent that the electric environment then replaced that economic class-based approach with a mass media approach, we are going through the same process again. We are replacing the mass phenomenon with something that is better described by subsidiarity. Now, does that mean that the elites are no longer important? No. And in fact, as has been, I think, in interesting detail described in recent articles, much of this being stimulated, obviously, by current events, but some of this actually having been in the background and now being brought into the foreground. The failure of Western elites is so thorough and remarkable. It is reflected in Victor Guyton's subtitle about the American Armageddon. The lack of not just strategy, but the lack of moral coherence on their part forces new elites to emerge. And as we reorganize our democratic system around responsibilities at the lowest possible level, as we replace the current elites with new elites, we are in for a rough ride. I can guarantee you that this is not going to be an easy one, which is why I have expressed a few times here. I hope that these discussions in the lives of the people who have joined together here wind up being of some help.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Next up, let's take the question about social justice. So this was by, give me just a second. This was by Carol. She asked, what are the tactical implications for social justice? What about the poor and other vulnerables?
Right. As I went through rather quickly, described in some more detail in the previous course, the West is now dramatically engaged in an effort to retrieve its virtues. And of those virtues, particularly the virtues as emphasized by the Roman Catholic Church, charity is absolutely paramount. The largest single organization in the world today, and undoubtedly historically, in terms of addressing the question of poverty, along with other deeply embedded systematic problems, is very likely the Catholic Church. So as we begin to incorporate natural law into our understandings, as we begin to remember what it means to be human in a virtuous sense, all of those structural economic issues which have generated homelessness, poverty, addictions, and so forth, must all be looked at in a new way. So what we said at one point in the slides was new paradigm, new structures. I think it was new geopolitical structures, but we could just as well say new economic structures. There's absolutely no reason for us to take for granted the structures of the world in which the modern world in which we have now exited. There is no reason why the political, economic, and moral structure of our world, no reason why it even could, at this point, imagine that it could stay the same. It has to change. These fundamental changes I am suggesting will bring us back to a different understanding of all these phenomena. And so I will just end my answer to you by saying that the term social justice was invented by the Catholic Church in the 19th century. The term social justice, with a meaning close to what we would use for today, was in wide circulation in the decades before Pope Leo XIII in 1891, established with the encyclical Rerum Novarum, what we're now calling Catholic social teaching. So I'm very much in sympathy with the direction of the question here. I would suggest that tactically, the question becomes one of literally building new structures and moving into new structural arrangements is going on every day and all around us. And I encourage people here to roll up their sleeves and get into it themselves.
Connor has another excellent question. He says, how important is it for the West, for us in the West, to understand the classics of other cultures? Just like China is trying to understand the classic of the West, how important is it for us to understand Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, given that we are we have these three spheres?
So just to remind people here, Connor is correct. The Communist Party of China, CPC, by the way, as a small footnote, when somebody refers to it as the CCP, they are likely deliberately misstating the case. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt. They actually know that the CCP ceased to exist in the 1940s, but the CPC, the current organization, has made classics a massive priority. This began with Chinese classics, but has now expanded to Western classics, with some very funny descriptions about how the Chinese might have actually been responsible in some way for these Western classics. Therefore, they can claim them as their own. Somehow returning to a better and wider understanding of the classics in the West is absolutely essential. It will be impossible for the West to reestablish itself. It will be impossible, in fact, for a new elite to emerge in the West without going through this phase. And it must be all of humanity. My guess is that the one place on Earth where this is actually now happening is Shrikant's 52 Living Ideas. My further guess is that at least an aspect of what's happening has to do with what we're doing here, what this meetup is all about, and Shrikant's engagement with this. And so in a very small way, we are beginning to show as an example of what's necessary there. Center for the Study of Digital Life, the organization I started now 7 years ago, that's behind this lecture series, is also planning to start a graduate school called Trivium University. So I am devoting myself, my colleagues are devoting themselves to doing exactly what you have suggested. It's going to happen on a much wider scale, driven by new elites, which are now in the process of forming.
Thank you. I just want to add one comment to it. We've been studying Tao Te Ching, Bhagavad Gita, and Gospel of John in parallel for the past almost 8 months, each week. So we've done 80 plus meetups on each of them, something like that. And the most stunning thing is that there is actually a commonality to these three works, which is they are far more closer together than the Gospel of John is to the modern Western culture, or Bhagavad Gita is to the modern Indian culture. And it gives you it actually demonstrates Mark's point about the fundamentality of the psychotechnological environment, because all these three are scribal works, and you will see a way of thinking that they have, which is common, which is very different from people in the West and people in India, and my friends in China also tell me it's the same with China.
Yes, sure. It's the modern world that has now gone past its use by date. And so when you open up the refrigerator and you get out the carton of milk, and you open it up and you notice that it's gotten all chunky and it's starting to smell, that's the situation with the modern world. And as humanity goes through this process of trying to sort out how does it recover itself, it's right there, right in the middle of the highway, impossible to avoid.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
That's right.
So let me ask an overview question. Now we are at the end of this series. This series is called Digital Catholic Social Teaching. So how is the Catholic social teaching as it was originally conceived? How is digital Catholic social teaching different from that?
Well, it obviously has some critical differences. The first of them is that it's not on the defense. So as opposed to a Catholic social teaching under electric conditions, in which the Pope and his successors felt that they had to try to organize an army of people. In fact, the underlying environment is now in favor of this approach. That's number one. Number two, the opposition, if you will, has painted itself into a corner with AI. The inability of the AI researchers to grapple even with you would think, the relatively simple topic of ethics which they still can't figure out how to do. Just as of a week ago, all the top people got together at Stanford and said, we still don't quite know how to do this. That weakness. So if we were to go back to Catholic social teaching in the 1930s, for instance, quadragesimo anno, this required a global mobilization and required a quite deliberate construct of us versus them, the atheists in Moscow. Well, guess what? There are no atheists in Moscow anymore. In fact, the patriarch, by many people's view, is more important in what happens in Russia than Putin is. Things have changed so radically that a world in which artificial humans are being designed badly, a world in which the elites that are in opposition are falling off of the wall. Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together again. I would say the biggest difference with digital Catholic social teaching is that it really matters to everyone, Catholics and non-Catholics, that we begin to put much more of this into practice.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. This has been an amazing series, but I want to end, because it is Easter, I want to end with something. This morning, as I was telling Mark, and Mark mentioned, I went to 2 services, one Protestant service and one Catholic service. This is the first time I'm attending an Easter service, and my head is full of observations, both about the differences in the scribal versus print that is there, as well as the, our Gospel of John and all the Gospels that we've been studying. So I am going to do a meetup. The only way I can process this is to do a meetup. So at 9 p.m. today, we're going to do a meetup on meaning of Easter, resurrection of Christ. There are 2 things. What I'm going to do, first, you're welcome to come and discuss what you understand as the meaning of resurrection and meaning of Easter. Number 2, I recommend that you read, John 20, Matthew 28, Luke 24, and Mark 16 to get a sense of it, reread it. If you really want to do it, and this is what I'm going to do, is to read Aquina's commentary on John 20. His commentary on John is the best. So read that, because it just opens up the meaning of it. And I invite you to come. It's going to be at 9 p.m. Today. You can use the same link, or the same link that you used for this meetup, or you can go ahead and register. Look forward to seeing you there. Mark, this has been an amazing series. Thank you very much. It's always an honor to have you here.
Thank you all very much for your contribution to this. None of this would be possible without you. Shrikant has great ambitions about what we're going to do with this series, and I look forward to all of your help. And I want to applaud everybody for their patience and for their wisdom in this engagement. Thank you very much.